Why does the U.S. election matter to the world? Kamala Harris and Donald Trump disagree on nearly every foreign policy issue. From the wars in Ukraine and Gaza to the relationship with China, the next president will face big challenges. So, how's foreign policy shaping the U.S. election? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. As Americans head to the polls on Tuesday, their choice could prove decisive not just for their nation, but for millions around the world. The next president will inherit some major international crises, including Israel's war on Gaza and Lebanon and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Each of them is demanding immediate attention. So, how will America's next commander-in-chief handle these critical flashpoints? Would Trump's deal-making approach bring peace or peril? Can Harris's diplomatic stance succeed where Biden has failed? We'll explore these questions with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Axel Zajmowicz.
Still have work to do, but
we have to get you guys.
The policy divide between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris extends far beyond America's borders.
We were respected before Putin respected us. President Xi of China respected us. Kim Jong-un of North Korea respected us.
His rival warns this approach threatens decades of American diplomacy.
I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump.
The strongest divide emerges in Europe. Trump's Republicans threaten to upend NATO, with his running mate dismissing Washington's oldest military alliance.
We ought to focus on our own security, not subsidize European welfare. They can take care of themselves.
For Ukraine, Trump promises peace within 24 hours, potentially ceding territory to Russia. His team also suggests creating a demilitarized zone along the front lines. Harris promises more support for Ukraine and NATO allies, even though she could face Republican resistance in Congress. In Gaza and Lebanon, both candidates back what they say is Israel's right to defend itself. But Trump pushes for swift military victory.
He knows what he's doing. I did encourage him to get this over with. You want to get it over with. It has to get over with fast.
While Harris emphasizes humanitarian concerns.
The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time.
On China, both candidates promise tough measures, but with different tactics. Trump threatens to expand tariffs of up to 200% on Chinese-made goods, far beyond the Biden administration's existing tariffs.
If China or some other country is behaving badly, we have things called tariffs that are so severe.
Harris focuses instead on technological competition.
The third pillar of our opportunity economy is leading the world in the industries of the future and making sure America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century.
With polls suggesting a tight race, allies and adversaries alike are waiting to see which vision of America voters will support and what that will mean for them and the rest of the world. Axel Zajmowicz, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., Akbar Shahid Ahmed, Senior Diplomatic Correspondent at HuffPost. In London, H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. And in Beijing, Huiyao Wang, Founder and President of the Center for China and Globalization. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Akbar, let's start today by talking about the Middle East, specifically Gaza and Lebanon. Now, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris continue to cite Israel's right to defend itself. But are there any expectations within the international community forming as to whether a Trump presidency or Harris presidency would actually be able to bring about any kind of a de-escalation in the region?
Thanks, Mohammed. I think I'm one at a time because I think they're quite different approaches. I think there is some hope that a return to office for former President Trump could lead to a different approach, right? There's some sort of sense that, look, President Biden has been an avowed, committed Zionist throughout his career. The Democratic foreign policy establishment has not been willing to challenge him over a year. Could former President Trump do something differently? I am hearing that from sources. It's an argument I am honestly very skeptical of for a couple of reasons. I think Trump has been extremely clear. He has no fundamental interest in the humanity of Palestinians. Simultaneously, we know that President Trump is quite easily influenced, right, by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and by hardline pro-Israel voices who number among his top donors, his top supporters. I think you could see an effort by former President Trump, if he's reelected, to get a quick deal. But what kind of violence do we see on the way to that quick deal? And what kind of compromises, whether it's an Israeli reoccupation of Lebanon, whether it's new Israeli settlements in Gaza, what kind of tenuous deal would he build? I do think there's a desire for Vice President Harris, should she take over. She has watched as President Biden has seen his entire legacy become defined by these post-October 7th wars, their brutality, the intransigence, the horrors, right, of international law being violated again and again on footage seen all over the world with America's influence and kind of reputation in tatters as a result. She doesn't want that to be the story of her presidency. I think it will be a shift, but I think there is a real desire among Vice President Harris's team to chart some kind of different approach. Whether or not she'll be significantly tougher on Israel is hard to know right now.
Yeah, Akbar, let me just dig a little deeper with you when it comes to the Harris side of this equation. You're talking about that perhaps there is some expectation of a potential shift when it comes to if Harris were to be elected president. She has been perceived in the past to be, at least outwardly, more empathetic towards Palestinians in her remarks, in her presentations. But she's not broken with President Biden's stance when it comes to Israel if Harris does prevail. Is there fundamentally an expectation that U.S. policy might change even in the slightest degree towards Israel going forward?
The second President Harris is elected, there's a different dynamic between Washington and Tel Aviv because you don't have Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, two men who have known each other for 40 years, have a very particular dynamic that's been established in which Netanyahu essentially defies Biden consistently and faces no repercussions. So Harris is a wild card for the Israeli side as well. And what we know is that she's been tougher behind closed doors. There are several tools that she has available. She could change U.S. weapons shipments. She could affect U.S. diplomatic support for Israel at the United Nations. And really importantly, Mohammed, I think people need to understand there's a broader context here within her party, right? President Biden has not been pioneering this unchecked support for Israel with the full support of all Democrats. Actually, he's been really an outlier. So should a Vice President Harris be elected, if there's a Democratic-dominated Congress, and as Democratic voters who've turned up, what we know from the polling is that again and again, Democratic voters say we want this war to end, we want a different approach to Israel, we want a tougher approach, and we are more pro-Palestinian than we've been. I think Harris's team is a lot more attuned to that political shift and might take advantage of it, working with Congress, working on legislation to pressure Israel in a way that Biden hasn't been willing to.
H.A., you heard Akbar there talk about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and how he might react whether Donald Trump prevails and gets a second term or whether Harris prevails. I want to ask you a little bit more about that because Donald Trump has publicly stated that Israel should get the war over with fast, and different people interpret that remark in different ways. But if Trump does prevail, how might we expect Netanyahu to react?
Well, first, Mohammed, thank you for having me on your program. A pleasure to hear Akbar's analysis. Your viewers should know he's actually been responsible for a good deal of the reporting that's come out over the past year that's been very useful to analysts such as myself. When it comes to Trump and Gaza and Israel, there is a suggestion that he's going to push Netanyahu to move towards ending the war as quickly as possible. He doesn't want to start his presidency in January 2025 with a war still underway. And because of this very clearly stated preference on the side of Donald Trump, there's a suggestion that he's somehow going to bring peace to the conflict. And I think this is extremely misleading. What is clear is that he wants Netanyahu to declare that the war is over. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any more violence on the ground. Netanyahu can say the war is over today and continue to use IDF forces on the ground in Gaza, and can continue to use violence across the territory in Gaza, let alone with regards to Lebanon. It's simply a stated sort of, change in frame, but doesn't actually change anything literally on the ground. He could put settlements on the ground in the north of Gaza and say that the war is over. Saying the war is over doesn't mean the end of the occupation or the end of the siege or anything like that. So I do think that there's a very dangerous sort of risk that people are playing with here, where they think that because Trump says he wants to, quote unquote, bring peace, that means that there'll actually be peace. It simply means that he gets to start his presidential term in January 2025 and be able to claim that a new phase is underway, i.e. that Netanyahu said that the war is at an end. The number of times that politicians, including American politicians, have said a conflict is over on the ground, things not really changing. I think people should pay attention to history in this regard.
H.A., let me also ask you, if Harris were to prevail, I mean, from your vantage point, do you believe that she might be willing to apply any more pressure on Netanyahu in order to try to get him to enter into ceasefire negotiations with regard to Gaza or Lebanon? Because over the course of the past, well, it's been over a year now, but over the course of the past several months, so many people have wondered why Joe Biden will not utilize more leverage that he has over Israel to get Netanyahu to actually enter into ceasefire negotiations in good faith. Do you think that Harris would approach this differently in any capacity?
So to answer that question, you have to really ask another one, which is, why is Biden proceeding in the way that he is proceeding? And do those same reasons apply to Kamala Harris? And I think that when it comes to Joe Biden, there's a particular history here that goes back, many decades, right? It's a very historical kind of relationship in that regard. He's part of that generation of American statespeople and politicians who see Israel in a particular light and so on. Now, that doesn't apply to Kamala Harris. Of course, she's younger. She doesn't come from that background. It's a different relationship entirely. Having said that, she may have other reasons to proceed in ways that might not look so dissimilar to the policy outcomes of Joe Biden. And that's really about just maintaining her popularity among stakeholders for the Democratic Party. But that explains why she's proceeding in the way that she is right now, because it's the run-up to the election. And I think that, just as Akbar pointed out, wild card status for Harris is a possibility. I'm also skeptical about how much of a possibility, but it is a possibility. But that's assuming that she wins. Okay, and we don't have that, of course, as any guarantee. But my suspicion is that at the very least, she would be more critical of the Israelis, not only in public, but also in private. And right now, there's an active effort on the part of the Biden administration to not implement U.S. law when it comes to several policy issues as pertains particularly to the provision of offensive weapons to the Israelis. It's an active effort within the administration. She doesn't need to do an active effort in the opposite direction. She just needs to halt that active effort and let procedures run as they ought to. And that could be possible. But again, it's too early to tell with any degree of certainty.
Huiyao, I want to turn to a different topic now. We know that the U.S.-Chinese relationship has been, to put it delicately, rather fraught over the course of the last several years. There's been a lot of speed bumps along that road. Any indication of how Chinese leadership is viewing this election? Is there any sense of a preferred outcome or a preferred candidate when it comes to how Chinese leadership is viewing the election and who they might like to see in the Oval Office come 2025?
Well, thank you. Actually, I think that for both President Trump, former President Trump, and Vice President Harris, I think there's a big expectation actually on them now to really making peace, to be a peace president for both ending the war in Ukraine and in Gaza and Middle East. So I think for that matters actually, Chinese. I would assume that Chinese government would like to work with any future president of the United States to really together. To safeguard the peace and making peace plan for those who war devastated regions. I think for President Trump, he actually said he wants to finish the war within 24 hours or before his inauguration, which is great. I mean, and then China actually worked with President Trump in the past actually on the North Korea nuclear issues. China voted yes with U.S. on that stand, and then that's where President Trump started negotiation with North Korea. So I think things could need China help again, because China has a big influence in both Russia and Middle East. China is the largest trading partner for both Russia and Middle East countries, and same is true I think for Vice President Harris, because. I already see now there's some indication that both Israel and Lebanon government are talking now. So, there's indicate there might be a peace possible. So that's a good start, because I think also we see that actually in the United States and also in the summer. I was there. I mean, across the campus, you can see people really fed up with this war, and then we are actually seeing this war happening in your living room, and the casualties and humanitarian crisis. So I think it's really important. Either president comes up, China is willing to work with them in ending the war in both Ukraine and in Gaza. So I think China can play a very important role in making a peace with the future president of the United States.
Huiyao, let me also ask you specifically about the U.S.-China relationship going forward when it comes to both of these candidates. First, I want to ask you about Trump, because Trump has threatened to expand tariffs of up to 200% on Chinese-made goods, and that's far beyond the Biden administration's existing tariffs. Does China believe Trump would actually do that, and how concerned are they at the prospect of that?
Well, I think my analysis of both President Trump and Vice President Harris are the follows. For example, for President Trump, I mean, he actually wants to be a peace president. If he wants to be a peace president, China would certainly be a good partner. Second, that he actually said that he will put tariff on Chinese import EV car from Mexico anywhere. But if he said if it's invested in America, he will welcome that. So let's do a Chinese investment for EVs, for many manufacturing. The situation happened like Japanese in the 80s. China can do a big investment to make America again in the U.S. And thirdly, President Trump that on the Taiwan issue, he really thinks that Taiwan should pay the insurance, and then Taiwan has stolen U.S. chip technology. So I think there could be a way that we can reiterate the Shanghai Communique and Three Communique that all the president actually endorsed in the past. And on the Vice President Harris, I mean, she actually come from California. I mean, there's a large Asian community, American there, 6 million. There's 2 million American Chinese there, and so she knows all the concerns and the people in that community. And also,
Huiyao, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me just ask you one thing, because you mentioned Vice President Harris, because in recent months, the Biden administration, they locked in steep tariff hikes on many Chinese imports, and that includes 100% duty on electric vehicles. You mentioned EVs just a moment ago. Does that worry Chinese officials, and do they think that should be expected more and more if Harris were to be voted into office?
Well, I think that probably they would probably take a more pragmatic approach, because I think since Biden administration, they already started the talks in the climate, in fentanyl, in AI, in finance and treasury defense. So I expect that dialogue will continue. Harris will probably continue to on that kind of contain the risk and manage the risk, but of course keep the competition and allies alive. That's probably the policy. But again, I think this EV, China hasn't really started selling any EVs in the U.S. It's really a gesture of this kind of high fence small yacht. But again, I would. When they come to the next term, they will be more pragmatic. The high tariff are going to hurt U.S. consumers. I mean, you see the business is not happy. There's too much regulations, too much not to do it. And then it was hurting the company, hurting the economy. So it was really hurting her base. So I think in that respect, I think, there could be rhetoric for the election. I hope that the common sense and rationale will prevail after the election.
H.A., let's turn for a moment to Ukraine, because Donald Trump has claimed that he would be able to broker a deal to end the war in Ukraine even before he takes office. Of course, he didn't offer any specifics as to how he would do that. But how worried must Volodymyr Zelensky be that if Trump were to prevail in this election, the U.S. might cut off military support to Ukraine going forward?
It's an interesting question, because I think Zelensky is worried about that, but I think that also the prospect of a second Trump presidency is kicking quite a few European leaders as well in the proverbial backside. I think they realize that pinning their geopolitical security calculations for the European theater on whoever happens to be in the White House is no longer tenable. And I think it was Donald Tusk who said something like this a few days ago, that, we can no longer afford as Europeans to depend on the votes of a few thousand people in American swing states in order to then, calculate how things are going to look like for our own security going forward. Rather, European security has to be fundamentally about the decisions and the paradigms that European leaders are willing to put forward. And on one level, I think that's quite a healthy mindset to have, because that over-reliance on whoever happens to be in the White House has certainly brought Europe to where it is today, where without American support, indeed, I think the Russians would have rolled up right to Kiev. So I do think that Zelensky is very worried about that, and I think that it goes beyond Zelensky, that it's much more wider on the European scene.
Akbar, H.A. was talking about Europe. I want to ask you to focus a bit on NATO. How concerned are NATO allies about the prospect of a second Trump presidency? He's repeatedly complained in the past that NATO countries don't pay enough for their own defense. What must they be thinking right now?
So I covered the last NATO summit, which was actually here in Washington, and the whole conversation was about Trump-proofing the alliance, this idea of how do we keep it going, how do, as H.A. said, the Europeans take greater reliance for their own security and have less of a panic every 4 years about what happens in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. That said, there is such a deep institutional commitment, I think, in the US to this alliance. And I just want to encourage viewers to not fall into the trap of thinking Donald Trump can be sort of an emperor the second he is elected, right? There's a huge process, a huge system that he and his team have not shown kind of the capacity to meld to their favor and their choice. Should Trump be elected, I think NATO would face some very tough conversations, certainly some tough rhetoric, but Trump actually pulling the US out of NATO, that kind of prospect, I think is really, really challenging. He would face pushback even within his own Republican Party. I think NATO leaders are saying, how do we get towards a kind of settlement that makes Trump feel good and frankly makes Europeans feel good? And that's a conversation that's been occurring throughout actually the Biden administration. I think with Chinese intervention, with support from Gulf states and others, there's been a conversation of, can Ukraine and Russia reach a kind of settlement? Can European security be changed and taken to a different paradigm? And that will happen regardless of whether it's a President Trump or President Harris. Under President Trump, the risk is that it's a more aggressively pro-Russian settlement, and one that is seen as leaving Europeans more vulnerable, and therefore leading to military buildups, greater tension in the future. And I think that's where kind of the cards will be different depending on who wins.
Akbar, let me also just ask you, there's just so many international crises and flashpoints that are playing out concurrently. How has foreign policy shaped the U.S. election thus far? And is there a sense amongst the international community that perhaps Harris's diplomatic stance might succeed where Biden has failed thus far?
Among voters, foreign policy, unfortunately, is never going to be a top 5 or even top 10 issue. I think most Americans kind of take for granted their stature on the world stage, their passport that lets them travel freely, the fact that the global system was essentially designed with Americans in mind. That's not kind of top of mind for American voters. The Gaza issue has certainly been a factor for both Harris and Trump, I think in surprising ways with Trump, where he's tried to use it rhetorically. Both candidates, I think, feel a real pressure to show something different on Gaza and on Lebanon now, given just daily reports of killing of children, of hospitals targeted. For the international community, what does that mean? I think it means there's a real interest in how do younger Americans think differently. You have a generation of Americans who've grown up in the shadow of 9/11 and in the shadow of post-9/11 wars, don't want to be entrenched in something like the Iraq War or Afghanistan, but also are not dominated by the sense of how does the US project strength, right? I think it really is more about how does the US collaborate, cooperate, given that there are shared challenges, whether it's climate change, or whether it is dealing with the effects of migration and fundamentally changing societies. I think what I hear from international contacts about the US election is, how is the next generation of Americans going to reshape this? And I think that's a really interesting question where we unfortunately, since the American electorate skews much older, we don't necessarily get those tea leaves from who wins on Tuesday. But I'd encourage readers to kind of look more at not just campuses, but also the voices of younger people, right? Younger Americans who are more internationalist.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave our conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Akbar Shahid Ahmed, Hellyer, and Huiyao Wang. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.